Aaron Buchsbaum at his home in Tybee Island, Georgia, on December 29th, 2001, as part of the Georgia Legal Services Oral History Project. And Aaron, I think I'd like to start by just talking about growing up in Savannah and sort of how you're kind of growing up here helped form your outlook on the world and so forth.
Well, I am a native of Savannah. And I've really lived here all of my working life, except for being away at school and in the military and working in New York for a while. And I guess I'm a product of my environment, and that environment, of course, encompassed a very large, loving, caring, nurturing family. And my parents were both born in Savannah. And I had lots of aunts and uncles, and my grandmother lived in the same home that we did. My entire life until she died when I was about a junior in college or a senior in college. And, my family always had feelings for people. And I think whatever I am, I'm a product of that family and of that community. I grew up in the Jim Crow South, and it wasn't anything that I particularly liked. I can't say that when I was a young person I did too much about it. It bothered me intellectually, conceptually, but I was not terribly active in in the street sense of the word, but I was outspoken, I think, in a number of instances, and I think that's largely as a result of my family background.
What about your family background?
Well, just that my family strongly believed in justice, and it's justice for everybody. I think, as I mentioned, I never had to worry about where my next meal was coming from, or whether there was going to be a roof over my head, or we always had a car in the family that was available to drive. We were not wealthy, but I consider that we were very privileged because we really didn't have any serious wants. And I saw people who did, and it very much upset me. It very bothered me.
You said you were outspoken on a couple of instances.
Well, I mean, just generally speaking, I had my social and political views, and I didn't keep them to myself.
This is like in high school or whatever.
In high school and college and beyond that. I remember an accounting professor I had in my freshman year at college at Tulane. I remember his name, too, J.C. Van Kirk. And he gave a white supremacist lecture in an accounting class. And that was the first time that I really got my dander up. I really was upset about that. And spoke to somebody in the dean's office. Nothing ever came of it, of course. He was probably tenured professor at the time. Maybe that's why I never became an accountant. I don't know.
It's kind of implausible to give a...
Yeah, and, I mean, well, there was a great deal of publicity concern when I resigned from the Savannah Bar Association, which was many, many years ago, because they would hold social functions at clubs that had discriminatory policies. And that particular one that resulted in my resignation happened to be the Savannah Golf Club, which has Jewish members. I'm Jewish, but did not permit black members. And I thought that was an abomination, and the Savannah Bar Association, stating that it represented the legal community, should not have used those facilities and should not have gone into a place where the sign says, welcome almost everybody. And I tried to get the Bar Association to change it. They didn't change it. I tried to get them to adopt a policy similar to one that the American Bar had adopted after a controversy over a facility in Miami when the American Bar Association was meeting in Miami. And incidentally, Lewis Powell was the president of the American Bar Association at that time, later became Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and he took immediate and direct action. He pulled the meeting away from this facility and stated that the policy of the American Bar Association is not to countenance that type of discrimination. Savannah Bar Association did no such thing. So I wrote a letter to each member of the Savannah Bar, and the newspaper got hold of it, and it became a cause célèbre. The Bar Association, I think, has changed since that time, and but they never would adopt a policy stating that they would not use such facilities, and therefore, even though I've been asked by a number of incoming presidents, I've never rejoined the Savannah Bar Association and haven't missed it.
So it became a real cause célèbre when that happened?
Well, it got a lot of publicity in the newspaper, and I got letters from a number of lawyers, members of the association, mostly the black lawyers, who applauded my stand, and from some others from surprising sources who said they agreed with me. Of course, there were some who didn't agree with me, and I will not name one in particular, but I'll tell you about it after we're off camera.
Okay. So as early as college, you were beginning to, kind of formulate your views on the world and be outspoken about these kinds of
Yes.
opinions.
Yeah.
Speak out for what you thought was right and against what you thought was
Yes.
wrong. Okay, you come back here in 1958, and I guess you joined the office of Brannon and Clark, correct?
Brannon, Clark, and Hester.
Brannon, Clark, and Hester.
Right. I was an associate under the old Savannah system, which was you don't get a salary. We let you work here, and and you learn, and I did learn. I learned a great deal from Saul Clark about how to conduct myself. Saul was a very fine lawyer. Perry Brannon was an outstanding trial lawyer. His son is now a Superior Court judge, Perry Jr. And Ed Hester was another lawyer in the firm, and there were a couple of other associates there from time to time, and that's how I got my feet wet in the practice of law. Basically, you walk on the edge of the dock and you jump into the water and you start to swim.
Now, Saul had, of course, been involved with legal aid in Savannah for over a decade and been involved nationally since early in the 50s.
Well, he's Mr. Legal Aid in the state of Georgia. And as you know, today is his 95th birthday.
Right.
Happy birthday, Saul.
So I was just wondering, did he get you involved in that kind of network of activities? Or?
I'm sure that he did. Obviously, I was interested in it, and I'm sure that Saul had a great deal to do with my specific involvement in the organization, yes.
I mean, what kind of pro bono work were you doing?
Well, of course, we divided into civil and criminal cases. The courts appointed us to represent defendants in criminal cases. But in civil matters, whether they were cases in court or just office matters, we handled it through the local legal aid society, which was strictly a voluntary organization. This was before we really had a formal corporation with staff attorneys and things like that.
Get back in Savannah shortly before student sit-ins, the downtown department store sit-ins, the stuff at Tybee Beach, so forth. So maybe you could describe Savannah in the early 1960s during the early civil rights. How
about two words? Jim Crow. Savannah was a segregated southern city. I think we moved from that to a much more integrated society, to the extent that we are integrated, in a lot calmer manner than a lot of other communities. We did not really go through all of the problems that others did. We had some really wonderful progressive leadership in Savannah, both white and black. And we made pretty good progress, I think. We still have a long way to go, but we made very good progress.
Let's talk about some of that leadership. Who are you referring to?
Well, when things were getting active in the 60s, Obviously, the most prominent leader that comes to mind is W.W. Law, Wesley Law. Everybody calls him Mr. Law. I've been a friend of his for 30 or 40 years, and I still refer to him as Mr. Law. And he usually calls me Buchsbaum. So, and then we had, there was a priest at St. James Parish in the South Side, Monsignor Toomey, who later was transferred to Augusta and has since died. And it was called the Toomey Committee. He organized it and had members of both races and met together and accomplished a great deal. I mean, they quietly integrated the theaters and other things. Of course, there had been sit-ins at the lunch counters, the department store, the five and dimes and things like that. But by and large, it was done pretty peacefully until when the voter registration drive became very active here, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was participating. Some people didn't like these outside northern agitators coming in and stirring things up. So things got very active. Hosea Williams was involved with the NAACP at first and then split and joined the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And night marches had occurred. Williams was put in jail unjustly, in my opinion. A lot of this was orchestrated by Victor Mulling, who was the municipal court judge at the time. Incidentally, was blind, but not colorblind. And he had devised some really extra legal or illegal scheme to put demonstrators in jail, mostly peaceful demonstrators, to put them in jail under peace warrants, peace bonds, and had some method to keep them in for weeks and months without any possibility of getting out, and it's pretty technical. So those were things that went on in the early 60s.
You mentioned to me before the case of this man named Rick Tuttle.
Yes. Well, Rick was a graduate of a school in the Northeast, a liberal arts college, had been accepted to graduate school at UCLA, and was working in voter registration on West Broad Street, which is now Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, and was arrested on the John Doe warrant with the description, "Get the white boy."
Back to Rick Tuttle.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Rick was working in the voter registration office when he was arrested on a John Doe "Get that white boy" warrant. Rick had graduated from a liberal arts college. His father was the educational director of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration in Washington, and he was put in the Chatham County Jail by Judge Mulling and Sheriff Griffin and so forth. Interesting background on Rick. His father had lived in upstate New York and knew someone from the Anti-Defamation League in that small community. And when Rick was arrested in Savannah, he called his friend, who said, "Well, I know somebody in Savannah, and I'll call him." The person he called was Bill Wexler. Bill was, at one point, international president of B'nai B'rith. He was also married to my mother's sister, Dorothy, so he was my uncle. Bill put up his house as bond for Rick. Never met him before. And he called me. Meanwhile, Rick had gone to school with somebody who was clerking in a law office in Cincinnati. And that was the law firm that represented Procter & Gamble. So his friend heard about it. He spoke to the lawyers in there, and they called a very prominent lawyer in Savannah, who was with one of the largest firms in Savannah. His name was Alex Lawrence. Alex said, well, this is not my type of case. I know someone who might be interested. And he called me. So I got a call from Uncle Bill telling me about this man. I got a call from Alex Lawrence, who, as you know, later became a federal judge and an outstanding one. And that's how I got to meet Rick Tuttle and represented him. And he was a guest of Chatham County for 2/3 of the summer. When we took his case, we took it on the basis that the type of bond required by Judge Mulling was illegal. My uncle had been on city council at one time, and Victor Mulling had been appointed municipal court judge by the city when my uncle was on city council. So he knew him. I went up with him to Judge Mulling's chambers to tell him that we thought it was wrong and that, you know, he should let him out. And things that my uncle said to Judge Mulling would have put me in jail, because he told him he was, and when, at the end of the conversation, that he was narrow-minded and bigoted. And anyway, we left chambers with nothing gained. Coincidentally, as I mentioned, Judge Mulling was blind, though not colorblind. In his senior year in college, Rick had read to a blind classmate. And I made that known to Judge Mulling. It didn't make any difference. So we went to, we decided to use the habeas corpus approach. He was not in jail charged with any crime. He was in jail because people who lived near the jail were recruited, and they got 6 people who lived there who said that the demonstrations in front of the jail had threatened them and was disturbing them, and they wanted peace bonds taken out by these people. And Judge Mulling set a requirement that was impossible to meet, and that is that even though it was only like a $2,500 peace bond for each of 6, he ruled that you had to have 6 different pieces of property, totally unencumbered, which meant that if you had a $1 million hotel with a $1,000 balance on the mortgage, that would not suffice for one of the bonds. So anyway, that's getting into a lot of the technical stuff. But anyway, we had a couple of Superior Court judges that I spoke to about, I wanted to explore the possibility of filing a habeas corpus. And neither one really, I could tell, wanted to touch this case or any of the cases, because the demonstrations were still going on a bit. So we had a probate judge. It was called a court of ordinary at the time. And we had a man whose father was a very staunch white supremacist segregationist, Shelby Myrick. But Shelby Jr. was the judge. And we thought that he had courage and integrity. And at that time, that court had concurrent jurisdiction with Superior Court on habeas corpus. I don't think it does anymore. So I went to file it in the Court of Ordinary, file the habeas corpus proceeding in the Court of Ordinary, which we did. When I went to file it, the longtime clerk there, Miss Madeline McCullough, said, Mr. Buchsbaum, he said, you don't file this here. You file this in Superior Court. I said, thank you very much, Miss Madeline, but would you just do me a favor and mark it stamped, filed, and then you can give it to Judge Myrick. So eventually we had a hearing, and we cross-examined Judge Mulling, and my uncle testified that he had been willing to put up the bond to dissolve this peace bond so that Rick could get out of jail. And Judge Myrick ruled in our favor. Then the next step, we went to the chief deputy sheriff, and we said, Mr. Sheriff, here's Judge Myrick's order, release him. because technically in a habeas corpus it was Tuttle against the sheriff, not against Judge Mullings, because the sheriff runs the jail and holds the prisoner. So he said, well, on our records, Judge Mullings the one who put him in, so Judge Mullings the one who's going to have to release him. So I said, fine. So he went up to Judge Mullings' chambers, and of course Judge Mullings refused to sign a release order. And he reported that back to us, and I said, Bernie Harper was his name. I said, you know, you and the sheriff have bonds, and unless you want to get sued on your bond, you better obey this order, and let him out. So he let him out. Meanwhile, there were rumors that he might, that the district attorney might be looking to trump up some charges against him. So one of my law partners put him in his car and drove him across the river to South Carolina, where he caught a train to go back home and got to Los Angeles in time to go to graduate school. Turns out that Rick made quite a name for himself later in Los Angeles. He was the controller, which was a high elected office of the city of Los Angeles, and he became active in politics there, Democratic Party politics, was an elector for Robert Kennedy, and was at the Ambassador Hotel when Kennedy was assassinated, and then went on to the convention in Chicago, but without his candidate.
What other kind of first-hand experiences or observations did you have of the sit-in days, the early civil rights days, these rather tumultuous days in Savannah in the early 1960s?
Well, you know, the lunch counters, sit-ins, there were boycotts of Broughton Street, which then was the main shopping street and seems to be coming back in that vein. It was still very peaceful, relatively speaking. I mean, it was, as you know, the sit-ins began in Greensboro, North Carolina, but they spread rather quickly, and it was run by the NAACP Youth Council. And I'm sure that Mr. Law had a great deal to do with that at that time.
What were your dealings with or observations of Mr. Law during this period of time?
He was a very determined person, determined to bring about racial justice and economic justice, but to do it in as peaceful a way as he possibly could. And so he, in his position as president of both the local and state NAACP, started meeting with other leaders in the community. I mentioned Monsignor Toomey. And we were very fortunate to have had Malcolm McLean as our mayor at that time. And Malcolm wanted a progressive city, and he wanted a peaceful city. And he, you know, I think he saw that this is what needed to be done. So the community organized. And Mr. Law was very much in the center of all that organization. Malcolm McLean was in the center of it. Monsignor Toomey was in the middle of it. My friend Pratt Adams, who was another very prominent lawyer, as was Malcolm, was in the middle of it. And the community worked hard, and I think we did a pretty good job.
What other attributes would Mr. Law bring to the situation? You said he thought to do things in a peaceful way, but what other sort of attributes would he bring to the situation?
Well, I mean, he is such a deep intellectual. I mean, it's amazing the breadth and the depth of that man's knowledge about so many things. He would come into a meeting and you would wonder whether he was paying attention. He'd sit off to the side and he might be reading the New York Times or something else while the meeting is going on, but wouldn't miss a beat in the meeting. He knew and knows everybody in the community. As you know, he was a letter carrier. He worked for the post office. I don't know what his route was. He was never my postman. But it's just amazing, even today. You try to walk down the street with him in one block, it'll take you 30 minutes because he stops to talk to everybody. White, black, doesn't make any difference. he knows them all, and of course by reputation now everybody knows him. His reputation was not always as welcome in the white community as it is now. He was excoriated by many for his civil rights activities, but it seemed to be unflappable.
So you would hear people talk about law.
Oh yes, oh yeah. Even then and now, yeah. Some with admiration and some quite the opposite feeling.
What meeting are you talking about where he would like all of a sudden chime in? Or?
Well, we had a biracial committee. It was very informal. I think it was called the Toomey Committee because Monsignor Toomey chaired it. And, you know, we had frequent meetings.
And you were a member of it?
I participated in it, yeah.
Did he...
I was not in the, you know, I was not in the upper echelons of leadership in the community. I was a young lawyer who was interested in it but participated, yes.
One thing that strikes me is that this movement here involved a wide range of the community. You know, that it included, it wasn't just a handful of people, but it was really a mass-based community.
Oh, it was, yes. I mean, they talked to the movie theater operators, for example, and urged them peacefully to integrate. I mean, it's amazing. Here we are in 2001 and talking about this thing, which seems like such ancient history. The up-and-coming generation, I can't imagine, you know, and even when I think about it intellectually, I can't imagine not allowing people to go to the beach or to drink from a water fountain or to use a bathroom or to eat at a lunch counter or a restaurant because of their race. I mean, I lived through it, but it's still hard to imagine that situation ever existed.
Now, do you recall the sentiments that you felt as a young lawyer from Savannah with your sensibilities at that time?
Well, yeah, my mother was concerned that my civil rights activities might subject me to personal danger or that I might not be able to build a law practice because of my involvement in civil rights, but she didn't try to talk me out of it because she knew she couldn't.
Did you ever experience any threats or?
No, not that I can recall, no. I mean, I'm sure I lost clients because of it, or potential clients because of it, but I made a living, so.
Outside of defending Rick Tuttle, what were your civil rights activities?
Well, interestingly, one of Mr. Law's closest confidants, I think, was Gene Gadsden. Gene was a lawyer in Savannah, a very prominent lawyer from a prominent family. His father, Robert Gadsden, his wife, Ida Gadsden, was an educator. A school was named for his father. Gene was a friend of mine. And the Savannah Bar Association was segregated. So I mentioned the name of Pratt Adams, John Simpson, Malcolm McLean, a few others with me. We decided that the time had long since passed for the Savannah Bar Association to exclude black members. Well, it's passed for them to have excluded them, right. So we did a little politicking. What we did is we stacked a meeting. And we let people know that we were going to introduce Gene Gadsden's name as a member. And the only people we let know are people we knew how they were going to vote. And we didn't let any others know. So we stacked the meeting. I remember this is an embarrassment to somebody, I guess, but one of Saul Clark's partners, Ed Hester, was I forget whether he was a president or past president. Another one, Julian Sipple, was a president or past president. They were opposed to it. But we had enough votes there. So I remember we had the meeting at the old Manger Hotel, and Gene Gadsden was voted in as the first black member of the Savannah Bar Association. After that, others joined, and of course now it's virtually open to all the lawyers in Savannah who want to join. I just not happen to be one of them at the moment, that's all. So that was something that we were able to accomplish.
What other of your own personal activities?
Well, I mean, basically just in my own life and my own practice, Mr. Law frequently would refer people to me for various things, whether it was a discrimination matter or just a simple landlord-tenant problem or something like that. I don't know. People went to him with whatever their problems were, and frequently, if it was a legal problem, I would get a call.
You were saying earlier that he continues to do that to this day.
Yeah, it's been quite a few months since I've had a referral from him, but yeah, that still goes on.
But he still acts in that kind of role.
Oh, he is a father figure to Savannah. He really is. I mean, it's amazing the transformation from the days when the establishment in this community wanted to get rid of him. Can you imagine the furor over a letter carrier because of his civil rights activities, to the point now that he is venerated by everybody, including the newspaper, which was so anti-law.
It's funny and more than a little ironic.
There's a great deal of irony, yes.
All right, let's shift gears out of Savannah and more into the arena of Georgia Legal Services. This is how Georgia Indigent Legal Services and Georgia Legal Services came about in the late 60s into the early 70s.
Well, it started from a largely small volunteer organization, lawyers doing what lawyers should do, and that is giving back to the community and trying to assure equal justice for all. That it reached the point that we formed a corporation and started having staff attorneys and just expanding to try to meet the need. We still can't meet the need, but we do our best.
That's the short version of the story.
That's a very short version. That's a very short version. And you know, in Savannah, I can speak more specifically about Savannah than other parts of the state, but there was hostility among some of the bar because of the perception that by giving free legal services for these people, we were depriving other lawyers of clients. You know, it's amazing how some lawyers can squeeze fees out of people who really don't have anything. And it wound up, as you know, in litigation in Savannah.
Just a second before we get to that
Sure.
point. So it wasn't out of a sense of altruism, you're saying, that we are already doing this on an individual basis, but rather that, you know, we're losing clients.
No. It was the altruism which caused us to do it. There were people who didn't think that we should take cases for free when, sure, these people can pay something. And
now, were you involved in the effort at the state bar level to get state bar approval of the, you know, any of these initiatives that led to the incorporation of Georgia Legal Services?
Not initially, no. I got involved later.
Okay. Let's talk about the Dixon case in Savannah. And you were involved with that from the beginning.
I was involved with that, and it was a case in which there was a dispute in municipal court, and an effort was made to prevent Georgia Legal Services. By then we had an office here. Steve Gottlieb was the managing attorney here. He's now director of Atlanta Legal Aid. Rob Reamer was involved in the case. He's now in one of my law school friends' firms, Rogers and Hardin. And an effort was made by Joe Bergen specifically. I don't know how much support he had from other sources.
Who was an attorney?
Who was and is an attorney here, who did not think that a corporation should, well, and that was the theory of his case, was a corporation shouldn't practice law, but the fact is it was an absolute hostility toward the Georgia Legal Services program, and he tried by that method to prevent it from functioning.
What was the basis of his opposition?
I think it's what I said. I mean, maybe he thought it was socialism. Who knows what he?
So what did he do? That given this?
Well, I got involved in the case, and he filed an injunction in Superior Court to stop us from handling the case. Got a temporary restraining order from Judge Harrison, although he should not have granted a restraining order without calling me, because I was a named defendant. Without calling me, I was at my office. He could have said, Aaron, there's a request for a restraining order. Would you come to the chambers and let's talk about it? But he didn't. He just granted it. So anyway, we wound up in a case in Superior Court, which then later got removed to federal court, and Judge Lawrence wound up dismissing the case. That's the long and the short of it. I had two very good lawyers representing me, Sonny Seiler, who later became president of the State Bar, and Austin Katz, an attorney who was in Brunswick, went to Atlanta, now back in Brunswick. They handled the case, had it removed to federal court, and Judge Lawrence dismissed it, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed it without any order or any opinion.
Okay, well, let's go back to the beginning. What was the original case that came into question that you were...
I don't even remember the details of the case. Maybe you can...
Is it a mother and a daughter? Is that right?
That sounds, yeah.
And I have a Vera Mobley.
Vera Mobley.
Mobley.
Right, and Dixon, I think, was the other party.
And so Bergen, or whoever filed the suit, then said that you had no business, right?
No, we had no right to represent the other party in the suit. Mobley, as I recall, it was.
Because?
Well, because she could have hired her own lawyer, I think was what his concept was. And we had no right to do it through Georgia Legal Services.
As a corporation.
Right. I mean, he was raising the issue of can a corporation practice law, and Judge Lawrence went into the history of the Georgia Indigent Legal Services and the Georgia Legal Services program. We had to have two different organizations at one time because of the type of funding that we had. But his ruling essentially was it's not the corporation that's practicing law, it's the lawyers who work for the corporation who are practicing law, and they're governed by the rules of the State Bar of Georgia. And if he has any complaint, that's the forum he should choose. He tried effectively to kill the program.
And I would assume not only with the implications beyond Savannah, but perhaps even statewide.
Oh, it was a statewide program. It was a statewide corporation that was running it. We just had a branch office here, as we do now.
So he, by taking on this rather obscure case, and I believe I have this really obscure charge of
champerty and barratry, and yeah.
Which is what?
Well, encouraging litigation and seeking clients instead of having clients seek you and things like that. And so that was the gist of what he said.
So in essence, he was
trying to end Georgia Legal Services.
And there was a distinct possibility, of course, that this case that originated here in Savannah, you were a defendant.
Well, I guess it could have, but it didn't.
Who else weighed in on behalf of either party? And where was the Savannah Bar?
Well, I don't recall the Savannah Bar Association was involved in it. It may have been, but the State Bar of Georgia came on our side, and I think that's how Sonny Seiler got into it, and Austin Katz through the State Bar.
And the president of the State Bar was
I forgot what.
Cubby Snow?
Cubbage?
Yeah.
Yeah, Cubbage may have been the president at that time. But we had great support from the leadership of the State Bar of Georgia. And as a matter of fact, the presidents, the founders of Georgia Legal Services were very prominent members of the State Bar of Georgia. Bill Ide and Phil Heiner, Jim Elliott, Charlie Lester, really leaders in the state bar have been the ones who have been leaders in Georgia Legal Services. It's been a wonderful working relationship.
I have at the time the Savannah Bar president was Charles Sparkman.
Charlie Sparkman, okay.
What
I don't remember specifically, but I do remember, now that you mentioned Charlie's name, Charlie was one of the ones who wrote me a very complimentary letter when I resigned from the Savannah Bar Association. And that was a very welcome surprise.
So this case dragged on for really, I mean, were you blindsided by it when it came up?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I had no idea that anything like that was brewing.
And so your immediate reaction once the suit was filed was what?
My immediate reaction, well, I can't quote my immediate reaction. That would be censored. I think you'd bleep it out. But I had a strong immediate reaction, let's put it that way. And it was rather negative toward the suit.
Did you ever see Bergen around?
Oh, yeah, I still see him occasionally. I still have as much respect for him as I always had.
Okay. And he, I mean, obviously felt that he had the wherewithal to possibly dismantle the whole.
Well, I think that's what he wanted to do. I'm sure he had some backing. I don't mean financial necessarily, because Joe is a pretty determined guy, and when he wants to set about doing something, he goes about doing it. And my guess is he probably did it without any financial remuneration.
And you said before that you had known Alec Lawrence from way back.
Yeah, I mean, I had known him, from a distance. He was a corporate lawyer and always used to go, I think, to the Overthorpe Club for lunch and maybe for a martini. I'm not sure of that. And at the time that he was being considered for nomination to the federal court, I was rather appalled, frankly, because I did not think that particularly a Democratic president should have considered him. Turns out I was just a little bit off, just only 180 degrees wrong. Turned out to be an outstanding judge.
And his ruling in this case was that all of this was, that the State Bar Association was properly...
Right. The State Bar of Georgia, it would be the organization to determine whether any person or organization was engaged in the unauthorized practice of law. Incidentally, I later had conscientious objector cases for Judge Lawrence, and I had the First Amendment cases before Judge Lawrence, and he was just an outstanding judge. Yeah.
All right, well, this obviously was a huge challenge for the whole statewide program, not only the Savannah office. So
oh, sure.
What other challenges are out there in the early years, say the first decade of Georgia Legal Services, the moves to the sort of statewide apparatus?
Well, funding was always a problem. Most of the funding, we had state funding, we had local funding, we had United Way funding, but the major funding had to come from federal sources. And we were at one time under the Office of Economic Opportunity before Congress formed the Legal Services Corporation.
And the Legal Services Corporation, if I'm not mistaken, was formed in 1974, something like that? Is that right?
That sounds about right.
And that's right.
You're a historian, so you should know, and I'm not charged with knowing dates.
But anyway, it's shortly after that you go on the board and then become president of Georgia Legal Services.
Yeah, I was probably on the board at the time. I believe I may have been before that. I was president from 76 to 81. That was a long tenure. But we had an outstanding executive director at that time, John Cromarty, who later fulfilled his lifelong desire to become a Methodist minister. He was a lawyer from Gainesville, and he commuted from Gainesville. The whole time he was running the office out of Atlanta, and he was a steady hand at our helm. And we needed it because we had all sorts of funding problems, but during his tenure, and I just happened to be the president at the time, but John's the one who gets the credit for it. The Georgia Legal Services program just grew and really covered the entire state.
In large part because of the infusion of federal dollars.
No question about it. We needed that. And with federal dollars, then later became some restrictions on the types of cases we could handle and not handle. And with still a problem of funding. You know, we now have a foundation, as you're probably aware, thanks to Judge Shube, another Savanian who's a senior federal judge in Atlanta. There was some money left over from some airlines litigation. People remember those scripts that you got from the airlines because of their anti-competitive activities that resulted in litigation in his court. And under the Cypre doctrine, he allocated $1 million to Atlanta Legal Aid and to Georgia Legal Services. Atlanta Legal Aid took the money into its own house. Georgia Legal Services decided to form a separate foundation, and I've been on that foundation board.
What were some of the major issues, challenges, directions while you were either a board member or president?
I guess there were largely issues of funding and in types of cases that we could handle. Those seem to be the major problems. Right, right.
And did you know, wasn't Hillary Rodham Clinton involved with legal services at that time?
If she was, it was not to my knowledge. I have no idea. She was not involved with Georgia Legal Services. Right. I don't know. You know, one of our former directors, Betty Cara, became the director of National Legal Aid and Defender Association. She occupied that post for 2 or 3 years. But no, I was not involved with Hillary Rodham.
Well, describe maybe John Carmody's sort of attributes, what he brought.
John was very calm, was very well organized, had highest ethical standards, was a good lawyer. He was a good manager. He was a good executive. I mean, he was everything we needed. We were very lucky to have had him. The person that he succeeded was a rather weak leader. And John served for about 15 years, I think.
So what would be his relationship with the board, or what would be the board's responsibility?
The board basically oversaw what John was doing. We set policy, and but a lot of the policy was based on John's recommendation too.
Any landmark cases that you recall from that period?
I'm sure that there are.
I mean, I have some, but you know, let me just throw out some. You know, Williams v. Butts, which was the Farmers Home foreclosures. Do you remember that?
I don't remember it specifically, no.
Or I guess did you serve on the board with Herman Lodge?
Oh yes, yeah. Herman succeeded me as president, and he was involved in his litigation in Wayne County, which is where he was from.
Burke
County, Waynesboro. I mean, Wayne County's Jessup, Burke County.
Because obviously that was one of the signal cases for Georgia Legal Services, the voting rights case involving Burke County.
Right, I remember that. Yes, Herman was the first non-lawyer who was president of Georgia Legal Services, and he was on the board during my presidency.
Do you remember any about, there's Scott v. Parham or Crane v. Matthews? Or
the names of the cases are familiar, but I'm not able to recall the details of them.
Were you involved with any, signal cases?
No, not as a litigant or as a counsel.
What kind of contact did you have as a board member or president with the governor of Georgia? Would have been Carter, and then following Carter, I guess, Busby.
We really did not have. We had liaison with the legislature and with the governor's office, but I personally was not involved in those contacts. I did later serve on a commission that Governor Carter had appointed, but that was not from Georgia Legal Services.
What were your main activities, though, in terms of Georgia Legal Services? And obviously board and president, but what, as president, work with Cromartie. Any particular initiatives that you undertook,
I'm really having a difficult time recalling some of those things because that was a quarter of a century ago, Cliff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what about growth?
I don't.
Pains. You went from 8 offices to 21. You went from $2 million budget to 7
to about 7. Yeah. I mean, that was basically what characterized the administration, if you can call it my administration. I really still think of it as John's administration. Yeah, we did expand rapidly, and we needed to, and I think, again, it's a testament to John's organization and administrative ability that we were able to do so in as smooth a method as we did, because it was not easy.
It's not easy.
But we opened new offices. We had to have managing and supervising attorneys and staffs and locations, and I mean, the logistics of it, it goes beyond the practice of law. It's running an organization. And that was something that took a great deal of administrative skill. Unfortunately, John Cromartie had it.
Could you talk a little bit about the internships that you've established at Emory?
Oh, well, I'm an active alumnus of Emory Law School, have been on the Law School Council, and instead of making just the contributions to the law school, I wanted to do something that would be of benefit to Georgia Legal Services. So I talked with Phyllis Holman, who's succeeded John Cromartie as director and has been director for a decade. And Georgia Legal Services has summer interns, students who come work in the offices, and I agreed to do what I could to fund an Emory law student who wanted to work in an office at Georgia Legal Services. Phyllis tells me that of the 4 that I worked on, 3 have stayed on and are staff attorneys with Georgia Legal Services, and I find that very satisfying.
You said there's still a need. You said despite the great expansion in the budget.
Oh, well, I mean, there's so many cases that we cannot handle. We could, there are a lot of people who need legal services who are not getting them. And unfortunately, we have to turn people away because we have limitations in the staff and what we can do. I think we do a terrific job with what we have. I think Bill Broker does a terrific job in the Savannah office, and Phyllis does a great job statewide.
Well, they say we have about 2.5 minutes on the tape, but let me just ask you that to maybe provide some concluding remarks, either about the changes you've seen in Savannah or the changes you've seen in the practice of poverty law, or if you want to talk about district law.
Well, let me... I could talk about either one for a long time. As far as the one major change in the operation of Georgia Legal Services is the encouragement of pro bono activities by the private bar. And that's worked particularly well in Savannah. I think it's worked in other areas too. But again, the Bill Broker has established a relationship, and I think before that too, Phyllis and Phil Merkel and other people who ran the Savannah office. The relationship between the private bar in Savannah and the Georgia Legal Services is again another 180-degree shift from one of antagonism to one of tremendous cooperation and mutual respect. And that's been a big, big change for the better.
So you're saying originally was antagonism?
Well, there was antagonism among many, not, obviously not from the Saul Clarks and others who had been interested in legal services all along, or legal aid as it was then called. But yes, there were quite a few. Savannah is essentially a conservative community and a free enterprise type community, and the thought was, well, let these people get their own lawyers or whatever it is. And, landlords didn't like what we did in representing tenants, and banks and finance companies and mortgagees didn't like what we did in trying to have people in the housing, and employers weren't always happy if we involved representing employees. And in my private practice, I represent I represent on both sides of those issues. So, there was some built-in hostility, but I don't think that exists to that extent anymore. Some people still resent the fact and say, well, so-and-so really doesn't have a case, but he or she knows that he's not paying for it, and therefore they can make my life miserable and make me spend all that money to evict him or to collect on this debt or whatever it is. But I guess that's the nature of the profession. We're an adversarial profession, and people on one side don't always like what's going on the other side. But the point is that people who do not have the wherewithal are entitled to justice the same way that those of us who do think we're entitled to.
What accounts for the 180-degree shift that you were talking about, in terms of the attitude of the private bar here in Savannah towards...
Well, I think an effort was made by Georgia Legal Services to explain to the bar what we do and why we need it. And I think when I say the bar, I'm talking about just the private practice of lawyers in general, not necessarily in an organized way, though they have reached out to the Savannah Bar Association. The State Bar of Georgia, as I mentioned, was always supportive of Georgia Legal Services. It was really the instrumentality that brought it about. So the hostility was local rather than statewide.
That's interesting.
But there are the Saul Clarks, and there were the Pratt Adams and others in Savannah who saw the necessity for it, and the staff of Georgia Legal Services, the Phyllis and Bill and Phil and others, decided that, to patch things up and work with the local bar, and were able to do so. And I guess some of the leaders of the local bar, they've elected some who no longer showed hostility to providing legal services for indigents.
I saw that Phyllis was on the staff here at the time of the Dixon case.
Yes. Yeah, Phyllis was in it, and Steve. The two directors of the major organizations were both in Savannah at the time.
Now, how much did that consume you, that case?
Not a tremendous amount, really, because I had very good lawyers. I became, I had started off as a lawyer in the case with Mobley and wound up as a defendant. And in the case in which I was a defendant, my lawyers did a very good job.
As you look back at your own career, not only in legal services, but more generally civil rights, civil liberties, First Amendment, whatever, what are some of the things that you can look back at with most pride, or you see as a legacy or whatever?
Well, I just basically felt that I wanted to involve myself in civil rights and civil liberties, and I did, and I've developed a reputation for that. And interestingly, in my office, I don't have my Emory Law School diploma or my Tulane undergraduate diploma on the wall, or my admission to the United States Supreme Court or any bar. The only thing I have on the wall, I have a plaque from the NAACP for their Freedom Award that I got one year. I have a plaque from the Younger Lawyers section of the Savannah Bar Association giving me the Robbie Robinson Award. And I have one from the EOA, the Economic Opportunity Authorities, in a similar vein. Those are the only things I have on the wall, plus the photograph of, and I should have mentioned this earlier, I had an uncle, Matthew Levy, who was a New York State Supreme Court justice. That's the equivalent to a Superior Court judge in Georgia. It's a trial court. He was a member of the Liberal Party in New York, had been very active in the American Labor Party, and when the communists began to take over the Labor Party, a group of them split off and formed the Liberal Party and fought vigorously against the Communist Party. And I wouldn't say that he was necessarily an influence, but he was somewhat of a model in the type of things I did. He was a labor lawyer representing labor, as was your friend Joe Jacobs and my friend Harris Jacobs in Atlanta, before he went on the bench, appointed originally by LaGuardia. So anyway, I have a photograph of Uncle Matt in his robes with an inscription to me on it, and those are the things that I have on the wall, plus pictures of my parents.
And Matt was a model, at least, for you.
He was to some extent a model, and it was not necessarily because of him that I went into the law practice, but he had, when he was in Savannah High School, he used to play hooky from school and go down and to Judge Meldrum's court. Judge Meldrum was a Superior Court judge who later became president of the American Bar Association. And Uncle Matt knew he wanted to go into the law, and that's what he did.
So he originated here in Savannah.
Yes, yeah. He went to University of Georgia and then to Harvard Law School, and then went to New York to practice. Never really came back here except for family visits.
Now, you said before that we could spend a long time talking about WW law as well.
Well, I think I said he he is an intellectual. He knows as much about politics and history and art and music as anybody I'll know. I love music. I'd drive 150 miles to hear a good string quartet, or several hours to hear a good opera. Mr. Law knows as much about music as most of my friends. He has a phenomenal baritone voice, if you've ever heard him sing. He knows all of the hymns from the churches. From his background, he's an avid churchgoer, and he's very kind gentleman, very determined, and when he sets about to do something, he does it, and hardly anything stops him. He was, I guess, the driving force in the Ralph Mark Gilbert Civil Rights Museum being what it is and where it is. There were some others who thought it should have been at another location, but this was his choice, and this is what prevailed.
Can you think of, I don't know, perhaps an epitomizing kind of story about Mr. Law? Something that kind of conveys sort of that.
Well, only that he is very much comfortable with anybody from any station and walk of life. I mean, he greets them on a first-name friendly basis, whether it's a bank president or the lowest laborer or unemployed person.
Except he calls you Buchsbaum.
Well, he does sometimes, yeah. Occasionally he'll call me Aaron. I always call him Mr. Law. I never call him Wesley. Though we have a number of mutual friends who refer to him as that. To me, he's a bigger than life figure. He's gotten an honorary degree from Savannah State University, and I think that brings a great deal of honor to the university, because I think he's bigger than that. He's just an outstanding person.
We should call it